Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and coach. You're on the Steady Coach. And today we're going to be talking about hyperacusis, which is high sensitivity to sound. And it comes with some other symptoms as well often that we will talk about in a little more detail later in this video. But what I want to start with here is, first of all, if you're new to my channel, welcome. Be sure to subscribe so I can let you know when new videos come out. If you're not new, welcome back. And if you're just finding me because you're dealing with hyperacusis and you don't have chronic dizziness, you may already be asking yourself, why is this video about hyperacusis on a channel that focuses so much on chronic dizziness symptoms? I'm going to make a much more robust case for this later in this video, but ultimately, if you have medically unexplained hyperacusis symptoms, then you are also dealing with a neural circuit disorder, and it is going to respond to the exact same techniques that I talk about here on my channel. So all of these videos in which I talk about things like graded exposure, learning how to work with fears, learning how to work with anxieties, learning how to express emotions, all of those things are going to apply to you during your recovery process if you have hyperacusis. You might also consider taking my free course, again, whether you have dizziness or some other set of ear-related symptoms. The techniques and information in the course are largely the same, and it is completely free, so you don't really have a lot to lose. You can sign up for the course by going to my website, thesteadycoach.com/free-course, or clicking the link in the video description. Now let's start with some definitions. So hyperacusis or hyperacusis. I have heard them pronounced both ways. I was taught to say hyperacusis in graduate school, so that's what I'm going to go with in my videos. Hyperacusis means that someone has abnormal sensitivity to sound. So for some of you, that means that even moderate or softer sounds become painfully loud when before they weren't painfully loud. For some of you, that also might mean that you hear a distortion or an extra sound when you're listening to sounds that previously didn't have that kind of sound associated with them. And in all of these cases, it can range from just uncomfortable to downright painful and intolerable. Now, before I start talking about hyperacusis from a neural circuit perspective, it is really important for me to stress here that there are medical causes of hyperacusis at times. So it is really important that your first stop be getting medical clearance from a trained physician who understands inner ear disorders. This is typically not a primary care physician. You will almost always need to see an ENT or ear, nose, and throat physician, or even better yet, a neuro-otologist, which is a physician who is trained, again, in disorders of the inner ear specifically. That all being said, if you're here on YouTube searching for ways to get better from hyperacusis, chances are you've already been medically cleared, and chances are that you've been given the diagnosis of hyperacusis, but the doctors don't know why you have it. And that's exactly what hyperacusis means. It is a symptom-based diagnosis that simply describes the symptoms that you're having without really explaining why you have them. And I know for those of you not new to my channel, none of this is going to sound very surprising. And you're in fact probably saying, wow, this sounds a lot like neural circuit dizziness. Indeed, it is, and we're going to get to that. So in order to understand how to treat your hyperacusis, it's important for you to understand a little bit more about what is actually happening that's causing it. Probably the most important thing for you to understand is that we don't hear with our ears. We hear with our brains. And furthermore, our brains use a process called predictive coding to understand sound. What predictive coding means is that the brain doesn't just take in information from the ears, process it, and then pop out a meaning. For example, if I hear a loud crash, my brain isn't just collecting that crash sound from my ears, interpreting it, and then saying, hey, by the way, that was a crash, you need to respond appropriately. On the contrary, predictive coding means that your brain is already using a set of expectations or predictions or templates, you can think of them any of those ways, to predict what sound means when it's coming in. In other words, Your brain already has a whole set of expectations, and when sound comes in, it's just comparing those expectations to the sound that it got. It's also going to judge the characteristics of the sound, including the loudness of the sound and the frequency or pitch of the sound, and compare it to the things it's had experience to in the past in order to quickly allow you to respond to the sound appropriately. This is much more efficient than trying to parse out and analyze every sound that comes in and figure it out from scratch. This is also why games like telephone work. So for those of you outside the United States, we use the name telephone to describe the game in which you sit in a circle with your friends and one person chooses a word, whispers it to the person next to them, and then they say what they heard in a whisper to the person next to them, and it goes all the way around the circle. And the last person to hear the word says it out loud. And it's hilarious to see how much the word has changed and become warped through these various iterations and interpretations of the whisper by several different people. How does this happen? It happens because when we don't have a good quality of sound coming in, say someone's whispering or saying something really softly or really quickly, our brain has to use its prior experiences to try to predict what the person says, and often it's wrong. And that's what I'm getting to with this entire explanation. Hyperacusis is a case of the brain's predictions just going wrong. The brain is misinterpreting sound that is actually perfectly safe, not dangerous, as something dangerous. And that's why when you have hyperacusis, you tend to also have this panic or even pain or big discomfort response in response to what used to be ordinary or just moderately loud sound. This is why the first line treatment for hyperacusis is exposure. And this actually is the key to getting better from hyperacusis. It's what all the big experts in hyperacusis use for their patients, ultimately getting people to expose themselves to sound more. And often they will throw in some cognitive behavioral therapy techniques to help people understand that their brains are essentially making errors, both in terms of thinking about what the sound means and in terms of interpreting the sound as something dangerous. So if you have hyperacusis, in many cases, what you need to do is slowly but surely expose yourself to the sound that you are avoiding while noticing the obsessive what if anxiety type thoughts and not letting them stop you. Learning how to work through them skillfully. Now, if you've already tried that and it's just not working, or you are so uncomfortable, things are just so painful and intolerable that it seems impossible, then you're in the right place. And this is why I'm talking about hyperacusis on my channel. Because similarly to dizziness, it is easier said than done to push through something that every cell in your body is rebelling against, especially when, if you do push, often that makes the alarms go higher, and then you wonder, wow, did I actually just damage my hearing or damage my body by trying to expose myself to sound again? This is where I think for some of you, going a little bit deeper in understanding how your nervous system got to this place and what to do to get it out of this place is really important. What I've observed through years of working with people with chronic dizziness, which again is a very debilitating symptom like hyperacusis, is that when we're not getting anywhere with graded exposure, we're not getting anywhere with thought-based techniques like trying to challenge your thoughts, what's missing is A, an understanding of how this nervous system prediction error cycle is happening, and B, what other factors are feeding into the cycle and causing symptoms to persist, even when it's not just your reactions to symptoms. So let me simplify this. Essentially, what happens when you are dealing with hyperacusis is your brain is making an error. Now that could really throw off anyone. If suddenly moderate sounds became incredibly, extraordinarily loud and painful, that would be scary to anyone, and that causes fear and anxiety to rise. You've probably heard me describe this in other videos on my channel as a fight or flight response. At this point, people tend to start to avoid triggers because understandably, they're very uncomfortable, but the avoidance further reinforces to the brain that this is actually a dangerous thing that's happening. In other words, when we have a trigger happen, and instead of facing it in a different way, which I'll discuss in a moment, we avoid the trigger entirely and are scared of it, we're telling the brain, you're right, that trigger truly is a dangerous thing, and we should totally avoid it. And if I ever come near anything that reminds you, brain, of this trigger, make sure you make the symptoms happen even more intensely so I avoid it more. So people get stuck in this cycle. Now, this is where stress comes in. And this is the thing that I think many treatment methods for hyperacusis are missing. When we're addressing someone's thoughts, reactions, and behaviors in response to symptoms, we are missing the context of what caused the person to start having symptoms in the first place, and we are missing the context of what might be making symptoms continue. And this is where, again, the idea of stress comes in. I've talked about stress a lot on my channel, and I want to be super clear here that when I say stress, I don't necessarily mean a big stressful life event. It can be an accumulation of small stressors over a long period of time, and it can also be stress in the way that we relate to ourselves and other people. That's just kind of an ongoing source of stress that leads nervous systems to become more sensitive than normal. Combine that with onset of symptoms that are really scary, and we get stuck in this cycle of anxiety and fear, which again are targets that we want to address using the methods I talk about on my channel, but we also need to address the underlying stress that's also feeding in to why the nervous system became so sensitive in the first place and continues to be so sensitive. And from my observations on people with tinnitus, hyperacusis, and chronic dizziness, people have varying degrees of contributions from stress and just the fear and anxiety surrounding symptoms. For some of you, it's so much about the fear, anxiety, and avoidance of triggers. And when you address those things and start to work with them in a different way, you get better. For some of you, it's a little bit less about the fear and the avoidance and the anxiety. Maybe you've learned to live with your symptoms, or maybe they're just not your primary focus right now. And in that case, what I've observed is that people have these long-standing stressors that are unresolved, that are causing the nervous system to be extra sensitive, and people need to find ways of working with those differently in order to allow their nervous system to come out of this constant state of fight or flight and start responding to the symptoms and triggers differently. So in summary, in order to recover from hyperacusis, what you need to do is break the cycle that's keeping symptoms going. You break the cycle by doing things like graded exposure to teach your brain you're not avoiding the triggers or the loud sounds that are freaking you out. You are doing this through working skillfully with fear and anxiety so that when you do expose yourself to sound, you can have a different reaction than you used to. But if those things are hard, it's likely because you have not addressed the missing piece of why your nervous system became as sensitive as it did in the first place. And this includes those of you who had a biological event set off your symptoms. Some of you, for example, may have had hyperacusis show up after a viral infection. That may indeed have been what caused the hyperacusis to start in the first place. But for it to then become chronic means that your nervous system was in a state of alarm and fear. And that likely has to do with things that went on before the virus even happened, and likely has to do with things that are still happening in your life right now. Maybe responses to symptoms and the way your world has gotten smaller because of the hyperacusis, but maybe other things about how you relate to yourself and to others. So to break this cycle, I suggest addressing both things, both the avoidance, the fear, the anxiety, and the kinds of stressors that probably led your nervous system to become sensitive and that are leading it to be sensitive today. Now, if that all sounds complicated, it's really not, and this is why I mentioned at the beginning of this video the free course, because it basically walks you through this entire process step by step. So if you are not signed up for that, please sign up. Even if what you're dealing with is hyperacusis or tinnitus, it still applies to you. Just skip the sections on dizziness specifically, like in step 1 where I'm talking about the diagnostic process. That doesn't apply to you. But all the other techniques, how you respond to symptoms, somatic tracking, responding to your emotions differently, relating to yourself differently, relating to triggers differently, all of those things totally apply to you if you have hyperacusis. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot more detail today on specific techniques for hyperacusis, but if you're interested in hearing more, I would love to tell you more. Just make sure to drop a comment or a question below that lets me know what you want me to talk about. And again, I really appreciate you being here on my channel. You are totally in the right place. People with chronic dizziness really understand what you're going through. They have very similar levels of distress with their symptoms. They have very similar levels of limitations with the symptoms they're experiencing. And there is just as much hope for you as there is for them. Again, if you enjoyed this, please like, share, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks everyone. Take care. Bye.